You know, when you walk into your local library, grab a book, maybe use a computer, do you ever stop and wonder what makes it all, well, work? We just kind of take it for granted, right? Well, today we're going to pull back the curtain on the invisible legal architecture that makes all of that possible. We're going to talk about the laws that literally build our libraries.
So let me just ask you straight up, what really keeps your public library open? What keeps it funded and available to everyone? Is it just, goodwill, a few donations here and there? The real answer is actually a lot more structured and, frankly, a lot more important than you might think. Because if you look back in time, libraries that were built on nothing but good intentions, well, they usually didn't last. They were these really fragile things, completely dependent on the passion of a few people and donations that could dry up at any moment. They just didn't have a solid foundation to stand on.
Yeah, let's call this early phase the library built on hope. It was a time filled with amazing intentions, for sure, but also a ton of instability. I mean, just look at the challenges these early libraries were up against. They were usually started by volunteers, running on fumes with whatever tiny donations they could scrape together. The management was, let's just say, improvised. And because they often had to charge for subscriptions, the services weren't even for the whole public, just for paying members. The bottom line? There was just no way for them to grow or even survive in the long run.
And this quote from our source material just hits the nail on the head. It perfectly captures the problem. Once that initial spark of excitement died down, or the founders just got tired and moved on, the library itself would pretty much vanish. It was a system built entirely on passion, not on permanence.
So, how do you fix that? How do you take a fragile, temporary project and turn it into a permanent pillar of the community? Well, you've got to give it a legal backbone. And that right there brings us to the core idea for today: library legislation. Put simply, these are actual laws passed by the government that create a formal, legally protected system for public libraries. This is the big shift from a library being a private charity to it becoming a public right, backed by the full authority and funding of the state. So what do these laws actually do? Well, for starters, they make sure that library services are free and accessible to every single person. They also set up a steady, reliable stream of public money so the library isn't just relying on bake sales to keep the lights on. This helps build a consistent, statewide system that's all about promoting education and, crucially, is protected from being neglected or having its funding cut on a whim.
Okay, so what does one of these laws actually look like on the inside? It's not just a single sentence saying, hey, let's have libraries. It's a really detailed blueprint, basically laying out the entire structure from the ground up.
A typical Public Library Act has a few key parts. It starts by defining its whole purpose. Then it creates official governing bodies, the people who are actually in charge. Next, and this is so important, it spells out the financial plan, often creating a specific library tax or cess to guarantee funding. It also details the whole administrative structure, like the roles of professional librarians. And finally, it maps out the entire network, creating a connected system from the state capital right down to the smallest village.
You know, this really drives the point home. Library experts and leaders eventually realized that temporary government programs or little executive orders just weren't going to cut it. If you wanted to build something permanent, something truly public, it had to be written into the law itself.
All right, let's look at a real-world example of how this all plays out. We're going to turn to India, which has this really fascinating and pretty complex history with library legislation. See, the adoption of these library laws in India has been a state-by-state process. It kicked off right after independence back in 1948 and has been rolling out slowly ever since, with different states, one by one, deciding to create that legal backbone for their own public library systems. But here's the big twist. Even with all that progress in the states, there is no single national library law for all of India. The responsibility is completely on the individual states, which has created, well, you could call it a patchwork of different systems and different standards all across the country. Now, to help the states out, experts came up with something called a Model Public Library Act. The best way to think of it is as a best practice template. It's not a law itself, nobody is forced to use it. It's more like a detailed, recommended framework that a state can look at as a starting point to write its own really effective legislation. So, the big question is, has it all worked? And like with any huge public policy, the answer is, kinda. It's really a mix of some clear successes and some really tough, ongoing challenges. So on one hand, these laws have brought stable funding, professional management, and long-term sustainability to tons of libraries. That's a huge win. But on the flip side, the fact that there's no national standard, combined with poor implementation and sometimes just not enough money, are still major hurdles. The law provides the blueprint, right? But you still need the commitment and the resources to actually build the house.
At the end of the day, it all comes back to this really powerful metaphor. A backbone doesn't guarantee a person can run a marathon, but without one, they can't even stand up. It's the same idea here. Library legislation is that essential, fundamental structure that allows a public library system to even exist, to grow, and to serve its community.
And that kind of leaves us with a big question for the future. I mean, these laws were designed for a world of physical books and buildings. But today, libraries are becoming these digital hubs, right? They're giving us access to ebooks, online databases, the internet. So what do these laws need to become now? What does the legal backbone for the library of the 21st century really need to look like?